This is a reading from the Mystical City of God, the Coronation by Venerable Mary of Agreda, Volume 4, Book 2, Chapter 10. The exercises in memory of the Passion practiced by the Most Holy Mary, the reverence with which she received Holy Communion, and other doings of her most holy life. 575. Without ever failing in her attention to the exterior government of the Church, as I have until now made plain, the Most Blessed Mary in secret practiced other exercises and good works by which she merited innumerable gifts and blessings from the Most High, as well for the common benefit of all the faithful, as for myriads of particular souls in furtherance of their salvation. As far as I can, in these last chapters, I shall, for our instruction and admiration, and for the glory of the Most Blessed Mother, write of these hidden and unknown works. First of all, I will state that notwithstanding the many privileges which the great Queen of Heaven enjoyed, she constantly kept present in her memory the doings and the mysteries of her life, of the life of her divine Son. For besides the abstractive vision by which she in these last years continually saw the divinity and knew all things, the Lord had from her conception conceded to her the privilege of never forgetting what once she had known or understood. For in this regard she enjoyed the privilege of an angel, as I have stated in the first part. 576. I also stated in the second part, in writing of the Passion, that the Blessed Mother felt in her body and purest soul all the pains and torments of our Savior Jesus, so that none of them were hidden to her or without the corresponding suffering in her own self. All the images or impressions of the Passion remained imprinted in her interior, just as she had received them, for she had made this request of her Lord. These were not blotted out, as were the other sensible images, through the vision of the divinity. Rather, they were made more vivid, in order that she might miraculously rejoice in her compassion, and at the same time suffer those sorrows. For this was her desire, during the time she was still to live in mortal flesh, and to this exercise she directed her natural willpower. As exquisite as her favors and privileges were, according to what I have always maintained in my discourse, they nevertheless were all pledges and tokens of the reciprocal love of her divine Son, who in our way of speaking could not contain himself or refrain from dealing with his mother as the God of love, as the omnipotent, infinitely rich in mercies. But the Most Blessed Virgin did not ask for them or seek them, for her sole desire was to be crucified with Christ, to continue within herself his sorrows, renew his passion, and without this it seemed to her useless and idle to live in passible flesh. 577. Hence she ordered all her occupations in such a manner that she might at all times preserve in her heart the image of her divine Son, afflicted, outraged, wounded, and disfigured by the torments of his passion, and within herself she beheld this image as in a most clear mirror. She heard the injuries, outrages, affronts, and blasphemies against him, with all the circumstances of time and place, and she beheld the whole passion as in one living and penetrating vista. Throughout the day this sorrowful vision excited her to most heroic acts of virtue, and stirred her sorrow and compassion. But her most prudent love did not content itself with these exercises. During stated hours and times she engaged in other exercises with her holy angels, especially with those I have mentioned in the first part, as bearing the tokens or the escutcheons of the instruments of the Passion. These in the first place, and then the other angels she engaged as assistants in the following exercises. 578. For each kind of the wounds and sufferings of Christ our Savior, she recited special prayers and salutations, in order to give them special adoration and worship. For each of the contemptuous and insulting words of the Jews and his other enemies, which had been spoken either in envy or in fury or vengeance, for each of the blasphemies uttered, she composed special hymns of veneration and honor to make up for their attempts at diminishing it. For the insulting gestures, mockeries, and personal injuries, she practiced most profound humiliations, genuflections, and prostrations, and in this manner she sought continually to make up for the affronts and injuries heaped upon her divine Son in his life and his passion. And thus she confessed his divinity, his humanity, his holiness, his miracles, his works and doctrines. For all she gave him glory and magnificence, and in all the holy angels joined her and corresponded with her, full of admiration of such wisdom, fidelity, and love united in a mere creature. 579. Even if the Most Blessed Mother, during her whole life, had engaged in no other occupation than these exercises, she would have accomplished and merited more than all the saints in all that they have done or suffered for God. By the force of love, her sorrow in these exercises was equal to martyrdom, many times over, and many times would she have died in them, if the divine power had not sustained her life for still greater merit and glory. And if, as is true, she in her immense charity offered all these works for the church, let us consider how much we are in her debt as faithful children for thus increasing the treasures of help which she left at the disposal of us unfortunate children of Eve. And in order that our meditation may not be half-hearted and lukewarm, I will say that the effects of her contemplations were often astounding. Many times she wept tears of blood, which covered her whole face. At other times in her agony she was not only bathed in perspiration, but in a bloody sweat, running from her even to the ground. What is more, sometimes her heart was wrenched from its natural position by the violence of her grief. And when she was in such extremes, her divine Son came from heaven, furnishing her with new strength and life, to soothe her sorrow and heal the wounds caused by love of him, and in order that by such assistance and comfort she might continue the exercises of her compassion. 580. The Lord, however, wished her to lay aside these sorrowful sentiments and affections on the days in which she commemorated the mystery of his resurrection, as I will speak of later on, in order that there might be maintained the proper relation between cause and effect. For some of these sorrows were incompatible with the favors overflowing in their effects upon the body, yet excluding pain. But she never lost sight of his sufferings, and therefore felt other effects of her compassion by uniting with her joys the gratitude for what the Lord endured. Thus, in the sweetness of all the favors of the Lord, his passion entered as a mixture of bitterness. She obtained also the consent of the evangelist St. John to remain retired in her oratory for celebrating the death and burial of her divine Son on the Friday of each week. On those days, St. John remained in the cenacle to receive those who called upon her, and allowed none to disturb her. And whenever he could not attend to this duty, it was performed by some other disciple. The Most Blessed Mary retired for this exercise at 5 o'clock on Thursday, and did not reappear until toward noon of Sunday. In order that during these 3 days no important matter pertaining to the government of the church might be neglected, the great lady appointed one of her angels to take her shape and briefly dispatch what would suffer no delay. So provident and attentive was she in all affairs of charity, touching her children and domestics. 581. To describe or comprehend what happened with our Heavenly Mother during the exercises of these 3 days can never be within our capacity. The Lord alone, who was the author of them, shall one day manifest it to us in the light of the saints. Also, what I myself have come to know of it, I am unable to describe. I will only say that beginning with the washing of the feet, the Most Blessed Mary commemorated all the mysteries up to that of the resurrection, and in each hour and moment she renewed in herself all the movements, actions, works, and sufferings as they had happened in her divine Son. She repeated the same prayers and petitions as he himself had made, and as we have seen described in their place. Anew, the most pure Mother felt in her virginal body all the pains endured by Christ our Savior. She carried the cross and placed herself upon it. In short, I will say that as long as she lived, the whole passion of her divine Son was renewed in her week for week. Through this exercise, the great Queen gained great favors and blessings for those who devoutly bear in mind the Lord's passion, and hence the powerful Queen has promised to all such souls especial assistance and participation in the treasures of the Passion, for she desired from her inmost heart that the Church should continue and preserve its commemoration in virtue of her wishes and prayers. The Lord ordained that afterwards many persons in the Holy Church should follow these exercises of the Passion, imitating his most blessed Mother, who was the first one to teach and practice such an exalted profession. 582. In these exercises, the great Queen sought especially to celebrate the institution of the most blessed sacrament by new hymns of praise, of thanksgiving, and fervent love. She was solicitous to invite for this purpose her own angels, and many others from the empyrean heaven, in order to assist and accompany her in these praises of the Lord. It was a wonder worthy of his omnipotence that the Most High should send from heaven multitudes of angels to view this prodigy of Christ's remaining sacramentally present in her heart from one communion to the other, and to incite them to give glory and praise for the wonderful effects of his sacramental presence in this creature, whom they beheld more pure and more holy than the angels and seraphim and the like, of which they had not seen, nor would ever see in all the rest of creation. 583. It was not less wonderful to them, just as it ought to be to us, to see that though the great queen was worthy of preserving within herself the sacred species as in a tabernacle, she was so solicitous in preparing herself anew by the most fervid exercises and devotions every time she was again to receive Holy Communion. And this she did nearly every day, except on those in which she remained in her oratory. She first offered up for this purpose her weekly exercises of the Passion, and besides this, whenever she retired at nightfall before the day of communion, she began other exercises, such as prostrations in the form of a cross, genuflections, prayers, and adorations of the immutable essence of God. She asked permission of the Lord to speak to him and to permit her, in spite of her earthly lowliness, to partake of his Son in the Holy Sacrament. She appealed to his infinite bounty and to his love toward the Church in thus remaining sacramentally present, as a reason that she should be favored with this blessing. She offered to him his own passion and death, the worthiness with which he had communicated himself, the union of his human nature with the divine, all his works from the moment of his conception in the virginal womb, all the virtue of the angelic nature and its works of all the just in past, present, and future times. 584. Then she made most intense acts of humility, professing herself but dust and ashes in comparison with the infinite being of God, to which the highest creatures are so inferior and unequal. In the contemplation of what she was to receive sacramentally, she was so affected and so deeply moved that it is impossible to describe it in words, for she raised herself and transcended above the choirs of seraphim and cherubim, and, as in her own estimation she considered herself the lowest of all creatures, she called upon her guardian angels and upon all the other angels, asking them with incomparable humility to supplicate the Lord to dispose and prepare her for receiving him worthily, since she was but an inferior and earthly creature. The holy angels, obeying her in joyful admiration, assisted and accompanied her in these petitions, in which she persevered for the greater part of the night preceding her communion. 585. As the wisdom of the great queen, although in itself finite, is for us incomprehensible, we can never worthily understand to what height rose her virtues and works of love on these occasions, but they were often of such a kind as to oblige the Lord to respond by a personal visit, in which he gave her to understand with what pleasure he came to dwell sacramentally in her heart, and to renew in her the pledges of his infinite love. When the hour of her communion arrived, she first heard the Mass usually celebrated by the evangelist. In these Masses, although the epistles and gospels being not yet written were not read, the consecration was always the same as now, and to it were added other rites and ceremonies with many psalms and orations. At the end of Mass, the Heavenly Mother approached, making 3 most profound genuflections, all inflamed with love. She received her Son in the sacrament, welcoming in her purest bosom and heart that same God to whom she had given the most sacred humanity in her virginal womb. Having communicated, she retired, and, unless some very urgent need of her fellow men demanded otherwise, remained alone for 3 hours. During these hours, the evangelist was often privileged to see rays of light darting forth from her as from the sun. 586. The prudent mother also provided that for the celebration of the unbloody sacrifice of the Mass, the apostles and priests be clothed in ornate and mysterious vestments, different from those they wore in ordinary life. Accordingly, with her own hands, she provided ornaments and sacerdotal vestments for its celebration, thus originating the ceremonious observances in the Church. Although these vestments were not quite of the same form as nowadays, yet they were not materially different in appearance from those which in the course of time came into use in the Roman Church. The material was more alike, for she made them of linen and rich silks, purchased with the alms and presents made to her. Whenever she worked at these vestments, sewing or fitting them, she remained on her knees or on her feet, and she would not entrust them to other sacristans than the angels, who assisted and helped her in all these things. Likewise, she kept these ornaments and all that pertained to the service of the altar in incredible order and cleanliness, and from such hands as hers all came forth with a celestial fragrance, which enkindled the spirit of the ministers. 587. From many kingdoms and provinces where the apostles were preaching, numbers of converts came to Jerusalem in order to visit and converse with the mother of the Redeemer of the world, at the same time offering rich gifts. Among others, 4 sovereign princes who were royal governors of provinces visited her and brought many valuable presents, which they placed at her disposal for her own use and for the apostles and disciples. The great lady answered that she was poor like her son, and that the apostles likewise were poor, in imitation of their master, that hence these riches were not appropriate to the life they professed. They begged her to console them by accepting their gifts for the poor or for the divine worship. On account of their persistent requests, she received part of what they offered, and from the rich silks she made some ornaments for the altar. The rest she distributed among the indigent and the infirmaries. For she was accustomed to visit such places, and often served and washed the poor with her own hands, performing such services as well as distributing the alms on her knees. Wherever it was possible, she consoled the needy and assisted the sick in their last agony. Nor did she ever rest from works of charity, either actually engaging in them or pleading and praying for others in her retirement. 588. She gave salutary advice to those princes or kings at their visit, admonishing them and instructing them in regard to the good government of their provinces. She charged them to watch over the equitable administration of justice without acceptation of persons, to consider themselves mortal men as all the rest, to fear the supreme judge by whom all are to be judged according to their own works, and above all to further the exaltation of the name of Christ, the propagation and security of the holy faith, in which alone the governments and reigns can be firmly established. For without faith, government is but a lamentable and disastrous slavery of the demons, which is permitted by the hidden judgments of God for the punishment of both those that govern and that are governed. The fortunate princes promised faithfully to execute all her instructions, and they afterwards remained in communication with the heavenly Queen through letters and other intercourse. The same benefit, in its degree, resulted to all that visited her, for all of them left her presence more ardent in virtue, full of light, joy, and consolation unspeakable. Many who were as yet unbelievers, on seeing her, loudly professed their belief in the true God, for they were unable to restrain the interior forces awakened by the presence of their most blessed Mother. 589. And such effects must not be held as surprising, since the great lady was entirely transformed into a most efficacious instrument of the power of God and of his grace among men. Not only her words, so full of wisdom, roused the admiration and convinced the minds by communicating new light, but on her lips was diffused heavenly grace for communicating it, and in her countenance shone the sweetness and beauty of heaven, while her own quiet majesty and modesty, grave yet pleasing, together with the hidden virtue, like that ascribed to her divine Son in the Gospel, attracted and refreshed hearts. Luke chapter 6, verse 19. Some remained speechless in admiration. Some broke forth in tears, others in exclamations of wonder and praise, confessing that great is the God of the Christians, who had formed such a creature. Truly could they testify to what some saints said to her, that Mary was a divine prodigy of virtue. Let her be eternally known and praised through all the generations as the true Mother of God, who made her so attractive to human eyes, such a sweet mother to the sinners, so amiable to angels and men. 590. During these last years, the Queen ate or slept very little, and this little only because St. John asked her to rest for at least a small portion of the night. but this sleep was only a slight suspension of the senses, lasting no longer than a half hour, during which, in the manner above described, she lost not the vision of the divinity. Her food was a few mouthfuls of ordinary bread, and sometimes a little fish, taken at the insistence of the evangelist, and in order to keep him company. For in this, as in other privileges, St. John was thus fortunate, not only eating with her from the same table, but having the food prepared for him by the great Queen, and administered to him as from a mother to her son, and moreover being obeyed by her as a priest and a substitute of Christ. Very well could the great Queen get along with even this sleep or nourishment, which seemed more a ceremony than the sustenance of life. But she partook of them not from necessity, but in order to practice obedience and humility, and thus pay some tribute to human nature, for in all things she was most prudent. Instruction, which Mary, the most blessed Queen of the angels, gave me. 591. My daughter, through the whole course of my life is evident how gratefully I kept in mind the works of the redemption, the passion and death of my divine Son, especially after I had actually seen him sacrificed on the cross for the salvation of men. But in this chapter particularly have I wished to draw thy attention to the care and the continual exercises by which I renewed in me not only the remembrance, but the sufferings of the Passion. I desire that the knowledge of this cause men to feel reproach and confusion at their monstrous forgetfulness of the incomprehensible benefit of the redemption. Oh, what a shameful, what a horrible and dangerous ingratitude of men is this! Forgetfulness is a clear proof of contempt, for one does not forget so easily what one holds dear. What reason or excuse, then, can there be that men forget the eternal blessings they have received, that they should despise the love with which the eternal Father has delivered over to death his only begotten Son, the charity and patience with which his and my Son accepted it for them? John chapter 3, verse 16. The insensible earth responds to the efforts of those that cultivate it. Wild beasts become tame and domesticated in return for benefits. Men among themselves are beholden to their benefactors, and when such thankful feelings are not forthcoming, they resent it, condemn it, and call it a great offense. 592. What is the reason, then, that only toward their God and Redeemer they should be ungrateful, and forget what he suffered in order to rescue them from eternal damnation? And in view of this very evil return, they complain of not receiving his assistance as they desire. In order that they may understand what fearful guilt they load upon themselves by their ingratitude, I will remind thee, my daughter, that Lucifer and his demons, seeing so many souls oblivious to the sufferings of Christ, draw the following conclusions, and say of such souls, this soul does not remember or hold in esteem the benefits of God's redemption, and we are certain of gaining it over to our side. For the soul that is so foolish as not to remember such a blessing will certainly not detect our wiles. Let us proceed to tempt and destroy it, since it is deprived of its strongest defense. Having in their large experience found their reasoning on this point to be almost infallible, they zealously seek to blot out the memory of the passion and death of Christ, and to excite a contempt for the preaching or discoursing about it among men, and they have succeeded to a great extent, causing dreadful damage to souls. On the other hand, they are wary and fearful of tempting those who have accustomed themselves to the meditation and the remembrance of the sufferings of Christ, for from this source they feel issuing against them a force and influence which often prevents them from approaching those who thus piously cherish the memory of the Passion. 593. I desire thee, then, my dearest, not to detach from thy bosom and heart this bouquet of myrrh, Canticle chapter 1, verse 12, and to imitate me closely in the contemplation and the exercises of the Passion. For thus must thou keep alive the memory of the sufferings of my divine Son, and satisfy for the injuries and blasphemies inflicted upon his divine person by his enemies, who crucified him. Seek thou, as long as thou shalt be upon earth, to compensate for the ingratitude and forgetfulness of mortals. And in order to do it as I desire, never let thy remembrance of Christ crucified, afflicted, and blasphemed be extinguished. Persevere in thy exercises, never omitting them except in obedience, or in a just cause. For if thou imitate me in this, I shall make thee a participant in the effects I myself felt. 594. In order to dispose thyself day by day for Holy Communion, thou shouldst apply whatever thou performest in these exercises. Imitate also the other works and practices which thou hast come to know of me. If I, the mother of him whom I was to receive, deemed myself unworthy of communion, and by so many means sought the purity necessary for such a sacrament, consider what thou must do, so poor and subject to so many miseries and imperfections. Purify the temple of thy interior, scrutinizing it by the divine light, and adorning it with great virtues, since it is the eternal God whom thou art to receive, one of whom nobody but himself is worthy. Invoke the intercession of the angels and saints to obtain grace from the Lord. Above all, I exhort thee to call upon me and ask me to help thee, for thou must know that I am the special advocate and protectress of those who desire to arrive at great purity for receiving Holy Communion. Whenever they invoke me for this purpose, I present myself before the throne of the Most High, and as one well knowing the disposition required for harboring God himself, I ask his favor and grace for those who are about to receive him in the Holy Sacrament. I have not lost in heaven the solicitude and zeal which I exhibited upon earth. Having asked me, proceed to also ask the intercession of the angels, for they also are very anxious to see souls approach the Holy Eucharist with great devotion and purity.